The courtroom buzzed with tension as Pam Bondi stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She wasn't new to high-stakes trials. She had built her career on them. But today felt different. There was an unsettling weight in the air, an unspoken resistance she could sense the moment she crossed the threshold. At the front of the room, presiding over the proceedings, sat Judge Howard Gates, a man infamous for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings. His reputation preceded him, but Bondi wasn't one to be easily intimidated. She had prepared meticulously for this case, a high-profile government ethics trial that could send shockwaves through the political elite. Her opponent, a powerful real estate developer accused of siphoning taxpayer funds into his private empire. The evidence was overwhelming, the numbers irrefutable. But something told her this case wouldn't be won by facts alone. As she approached the plaintiff's table, she caught the first sign of trouble. Judge Gates barely glanced up from his papers. He let the silence stretch, the air thick with unspoken condescension. Then, without lifting his gaze, he muttered, "Miss Bondi, I assume you've brought something of substance today. Or should we skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few chuckles echoed from the defense team's side of the room. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she refused to react. She had dealt with worse. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "the facts of this case speak for themselves. We are here today because millions of dollars in public funds were diverted, and it is my responsibility to ensure that justice is served." Judge Gates finally lifted his head, his expression unreadable. Then, with exaggerated boredom, he leaned back in his chair. "Taxpayer dollars," he mused. "Because, of course, that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." Bondi held her ground. "Respectfully, Your Honor, felony corruption charges are far from frivolous." Their eyes met, a silent clash of will. But before she could continue, he cut her off. "Spare me the lectures, Miss Bondi. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Something was off. Judges could be tough, but this was personal. Bondi took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew what was happening. Gates wanted her off balance. He wanted to control the tempo, to put her on the defensive. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She picked up the file from the table and flipped it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A." "Miss Bondi," Gates interrupted, "do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The shift in the room was instant. The smirk on the defense attorney's face. The exchanged glances among the press. Bondi didn't flinch. She had long since learned that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was never to let them see you falter. She paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word. Then calmly she set the folder down. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth but firm, "if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess so we can address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed. A clear warning that she wasn't going to roll over. Judge Gates' lips curled slightly. Was that amusement? Annoyance? It was hard to tell. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I just know a weak case when I see one." This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs. Few gasped. Someone whispered something under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Bondi could feel the weight of the room shifting, eyes moving between her and Gates like a tennis match. But she wouldn't engage in a shouting match. That's what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and met his gaze. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." And as she spoke, she saw something flicker in his expression. Not just arrogance, not just condescension. There was something else. A man who had a stake in the outcome of this case. And that's when she knew. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't being combative for sport. He had something to hide. But what he didn't know, so did she, We bring powerful, eye-opening stories that reveal what others try to keep hidden. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. And let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to shout you out in the next video. Pam Bondi had been in plenty of tense hearings before, but this was different. Judge Howard Gates wasn't just presiding over this case. He was playing a game. A calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? As she moved through her arguments, she could feel his eyes on her, waiting. Every word she spoke, every document she presented. He was watching, calculating, anticipating. She could practically see it. The slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, as if daring her to keep going. She wasn't about to stop. Your Honor, she continued, keeping her tone measured. These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly 3 times the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in state records. She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen, where the financial statements were displayed. Now, if you look here. Miss Bondi, Gates cut in. His voice laced with mock amusement. I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case. Right, he scoffed. And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this. There it was again. Wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. A soft rustle behind her. The sound of the prosecution team shifting, exchanging looks. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Bondi tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to. Denied. Silence. Bondi looked up. I haven't even stated the motion yet. And yet, I can already tell you it's going nowhere. Gates leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation. A little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption. The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly. Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents? Be too long. I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer. The courtroom wasn't just tense now. It was shifting, eyes darting, heads turning. Even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark blazer. Her brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence. She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that Miss Bondi. The tone was different this time. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed. Approached the bench. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, he lowered his voice just enough so only she could hear. I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Bondi. She tilted her head slightly. Excuse me. I'm saying, he murmured, that some fights aren't worth having. She let that sit in the air between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in just an inch closer. I don't scare easily, Judge Gates. A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table. But that moment told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a power move. That was a warning. A veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? She had walked into this courtroom expecting pushback, maybe even hostility. But this was something deeper. Judge Gates wasn't just biased. He was protecting something. Or someone. She adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. He didn't. Not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Then finally, proceed. But keep it brief. Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed costs total just over $2 million. She paused. Then, with deliberate precision, she placed another sheet on the projector. However, she placed a third document down. This is an internal ledger from the defendant's company, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. And here, she tapped the paper, is the approval signature. Signed off by. She hesitated, letting the weight of the moment land. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, crack, a ripple of movement, eyes darting, pen scratching. The defense attorney stiffened. His smug expression wiped clean. Judge Gates. He didn't move. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, his face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence hang for a moment longer. Your Honor, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? Calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she did have was enough to shake the foundation beneath him. Gates finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat. His fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. This time the shift wasn't just in the gallery. It was everywhere. A jury. The stenographer. Even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Pam Bondi took a breath then. Your Honor, this is a public hearing. That means every person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible, without reason. And this time, Judge Gates had no response. Pam Bondi sat motionless, watching Judge Gates with an unwavering gaze. The courtroom was silent. Too silent. It wasn't just the shock of what had been revealed. It was the realization that something monumental had just shifted. The foundation of this case, which Gates had worked so hard to undermine, was beginning to crack. A judge, especially one as seasoned as Gates, should have known better than to make a ruling so blatantly biased. He had declared critical financial evidence inadmissible without a single legitimate reason, in front of an entire courtroom, in front of the press, in front of the jury. And people were noticing. Gates finally exhaled through his nose, his fingers pressing together, knuckles whitening against the wood of the bench. This hearing, he announced, his voice tighter than before, is dangerously close to turning into a spectacle. Spectacle. Pam almost smiled. It already was. And not because of her. She knew when to push and when to hold back. And right now, pushing too hard would only give him an excuse to shut this case down completely. So instead, she leaned back slightly, adjusting her posture. Not defiant, not aggressive, but composed. Your Honor, she said smoothly, I understand the court's decision. However, I respectfully request that the jury be permitted to review the financial records as part of the broader context of this case. Gates hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. And that hesitation told her everything. He was calculating. If he denied this, it would be even more obvious that he had something to hide. His jaw flexed, but finally he muttered, "Proceed." Pam nodded once, then turned back toward the projection screen. But as she clicked to the next slide, something in her gut told her. This wasn't over. The signs of a cover-up. The rest of the day's proceedings were tense, but Gates managed to keep his composure. Barely. Pam could feel the energy in the room shifting. The jury had noticed his erratic behavior. The press had noticed. Even the defense attorney, who had entered the courtroom that morning brimming with smug confidence, now sat with stiff shoulders, stealing uneasy glances at his client. The defendant, Charles Lawson, a wealthy real estate mogul whose empire had been built on political favors, was visibly uncomfortable. Pam took mental note of it. Lawson had been untouchable for years. But now, for the first time, he looked like a man who realized his safety net had just been cut. The day ended, and as the courtroom emptied, Pam gathered her files, her mind racing through the details. She needed to think several steps ahead. Gates wasn't just biased. He was involved. The question was, how deep did it go? A whispered warning. As she exited the courtroom, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Miss Bondi. She turned, expecting one of the reporters. But it wasn't. It was Daniel Curtis, one of the court clerks. Young, eager, but clearly nervous. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. I don't have much time, he whispered. Pam narrowed her eyes. What is it? Curtis swallowed hard, then leaned in. You need to be careful. This case. It's not just about Lawson. Pam's pulse ticked up a notch. Meaning? Curtis hesitated. Then, in a near whisper, I heard Gates on the phone. Before the trial started. He was talking to someone. Told them not to worry. That he'd take care of it. Pam's breath stilled. Take care of it. The same phrase from the recording she had obtained. She held Curtis's gaze. Who was he talking to? Curtis's throat bobbed. I don't know, he admitted. But I heard him say Lawson's name. And... He exhaled shakily. And yours? Pam's stomach clenched. He had been talking about her. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Does anyone else know? Curtis shook his head. No. I shouldn't even be telling you this. Pam's instincts kicked in. He was scared. And fear like that didn't come from just witnessing corruption. Came from knowing that speaking up could cost you everything. You're doing the right thing, she said gently. Curtis nodded once, then glanced over his shoulder again. I have to go. Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Pam stood frozen for a moment, her mind spinning. This was bigger than she had realized. And if she was being discussed behind closed doors, meant she was a threat. And threats, in cases like this, didn't stay safe for long. The walls are closing in. That night, she sat in her office, poring over the files again. The numbers, the contracts, the evidence that should have been enough. But this wasn't just about evidence anymore. This was about power, influence, control. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. Text. No caller ID. She hesitated, then opened it. You should walk away. Before it's too late. A chill crawled up her spine. Not a threat. A warning. But from who? She turned the phone over, her jaw tightening. Backing down wasn't an option. They wanted her to be afraid. And fear was exactly what she wouldn't give them. The next move. The next morning, she walked into the courtroom with purpose. If Gates thought he could silence her, he was wrong. If Lawson thought he could buy his way out of this, he was wrong. And if whoever was pulling the strings behind them thought she would back down, they were dead wrong. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, straightened her blazer, and prepared for what was coming next. Because she wasn't just fighting a case anymore. She was exposing a system. And they were about to learn. Pam Bondi didn't lose. Pam Bondi walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of focus. The text message from the night before still lingered in her mind, but she wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. If anything, it only solidified her resolve. Judge Howard Gates sat at the bench, his face impassive, his hands folded as if nothing had changed. But Pam knew better. Something had shifted. She could feel it in the air, the way the tension crackled like an approaching storm. Lawson, the defendant, was seated at the defense table, his usual arrogance dulled by a newfound unease. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Lawson's attention wasn't on his legal team. It was on her. Pam held his gaze for a moment before turning back to her papers. If they wanted her to back down, they had underestimated her. The trap is set. She stood, straightened her blazer, and addressed the court. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to introduce additional evidence obtained through subpoena. Gates exhaled sharply, already shaking his head. Miss Bondi, I believe we've covered this. You're not going to flood my courtroom with unnecessary. Pam didn't blink. This evidence is directly tied to the defendant's financial records. The transactions in question were authorized by individuals beyond Mr. Lawson himself. The records show. That will be enough. Gates's voice cut through the courtroom, sharper than before. Pam's fingers curled around the edge of the table. He was panicking. I move to submit these documents as Exhibit B, she continued, her voice even. The jury has the right to see the full picture. The room was still. Too still. Gates inhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the bench, considering his options. Then finally, overruled. The documents will not be admitted into evidence. Murmurs erupted from the gallery. Pam's stomach tightened. She had expected him to fight her on this. But to outright dismiss the evidence. This wasn't just judicial bias. This was corruption in real time. And the entire courtroom had just witnessed it. Exposing the lie. Pam took a breath. Measured. She wasn't going to react emotionally. That's what Gates wanted. Instead, she turned and walked toward the evidence table, where a screen displayed the rejected documents. The jury was watching. The press was watching. And they all needed to understand what was happening. Your Honor, she said, looking up at him. Just so I understand correctly, you are ruling that these bank statements, these transaction logs, and these signed authorizations, all legally obtained, all directly related to the case at hand, are inadmissible? Gates clenched his jaw. I have made my ruling. Pam let the silence linger. Then slowly she turned to the jury. Then I'll ask you this. She gestured to the documents behind her. If there was nothing wrong with these financial records, why would anyone go to such lengths to keep them from being seen? A shift in the room. Gates' lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Bondi, I will not tolerate. Pam kept going. Because these documents don't just implicate the defendant. Pause. Let the moment breathe. They implicate someone else. Lawson's lawyer stiffened. Gates gripped the arms of his chair. Bingo. Pam's voice didn't rise. She didn't need to shout. She simply turned back to her seat, lifted her pen and said, no further questions at this time. And just like that, the courtroom erupted. Pressure breaks the powerful. The trial broke for recess shortly after, and Pam barely made it to the courthouse hallway before her phone buzzed. Another blocked number. She considered ignoring it. But something told her she shouldn't. She answered. You're making a mistake. Male voice. Whoa. Unfamiliar. Pam's grip tightened around her phone. Who is this? Beat of silence. You need to stop. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. Pam's heart hammered against her ribs. Let me guess. This is another friendly warning. Another pause. This isn't just about Gates. Pam inhaled sharply. Whoever this was, they weren't just trying to intimidate her. They wanted her to know. This goes beyond the courtroom, the voice continued. You keep pushing and you're going to find out just how deep it goes. The call ended. Pam lowered the phone, her mind spinning. This wasn't just about Lawson. It wasn't just about Gates. It was bigger. And someone with power was getting nervous. The CTA. A personal invitation. This story reminds us that standing up against corruption comes at a price. But sometimes the price of silence is even higher. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand your ground, even when everything was against you? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story inspired you, leave a like. It helps bring more content like this to light. And if you believe in the power of truth, join our community by subscribing to the channel. We bring stories that matter, stories that reveal what others want to keep hidden. And don't miss the next chapter, because what's coming next will change everything. Pam Bondi wasn't easily shaken. She had built her career standing up to powerful men who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. The anonymous call still echoed in her mind. This isn't just about Gates. It wasn't just a threat. It was a revelation. She was up against something bigger than she had imagined. And whoever was behind it was watching her. She tightened her grip on her phone and exhaled slowly. They wanted her to back down. They were about to be disappointed. A sudden disappearance. The next morning, Pam arrived at the courthouse early, ready to continue her cross-examination. But as she walked through the halls, she noticed something odd. There was a tension in the air, not the usual pre-trial jitters, but something more unsettling. She spotted Daniel Curtis, the court clerk who had warned her about Gates, hurrying down the hallway. "Curtis!" He stopped. His face was pale. "Miss Bondi," he said, glancing over his shoulder. Pam's instincts kicked in immediately. "What's wrong?" Curtis hesitated. It's Gates." Pam's stomach dropped. "What about him?" "He's not here." Pam blinked. "What?" "He didn't show up this morning. No calls. Nothing. His office is locked." Pam's pulse quickened. Judge Howard Gates, the man who had spent the last few days trying to crush this case, had vanished. That wasn't a coincidence. Curtis lowered his voice. "There's more. Court security pulled surveillance from last night. He left in a hurry. Alone." Pam's mind raced. Where would he go? Was he running? Or was he being removed? And more importantly, who had the power to make a sitting judge disappear overnight? She turned, heading straight for the courtroom. If they thought she'd stop now, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. A courtroom without a judge. As she entered, the murmur of voices grew louder. The jury was in their seats, the press ready, the prosecution team prepared. But the judge's bench was empty. A substitute judge had been assigned, Judge Robert Ellis, a man known for his neutrality and by-the-book approach. When he entered, the courtroom hushed. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Judge Gates is no longer presiding over this case, he announced. "I have reviewed the details and will proceed accordingly." Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside, her thoughts were racing. Gates was gone. And that meant whoever he had been protecting was now vulnerable. She glanced at the defense table. Lawson looked different. He was nervous, visibly. For the first time, Pam saw something she hadn't before: fear. Breaking the code of silence. Pam rose from her seat. "Your Honor, I would like to resume my questioning of the defendant." Lawson's lawyer stood immediately. "Objection. The previous judge's rulings must stand. Any attempt to introduce new." Judge Ellis lifted a hand. "I will make my own rulings, Counselor." Pam met Lawson's eyes. He wasn't the same man who had walked into this courtroom days ago, exuding confidence and entitlement. She took her time, flipping through the files before speaking. "Mr. Lawson," she began, her voice steady. "Yesterday, Judge Gates ruled key financial documents inadmissible. Today, he is no longer presiding over this case. Would you say that's a coincidence?" Lawson shifted in his chair. I wouldn't know." Pam tilted her head. "Let's talk about your connections then. Specifically, the people who authorized these transactions." Lawson's lawyer stood again. "Objection. Leading the witness." "Overruled," Ellis said without hesitation. "The witness will answer." Pam didn't look away. She could see it. The moment Lawson realized he was alone in this. No Gates. No protection. Just him. Pam leaned in slightly. "Mr. Lawson, I suggest you consider your next answer carefully. He swallowed. I was following orders. The courtroom shifted. Pam felt it. Everyone felt it. She stayed silent, letting the weight of those words settle. Judge Ellis tapped his pen against the bench. Orders from whom? Lawson hesitated. I need a deal. A shockwave rippled through the room. The defense attorney's face went white. Pam's heart pounded. He was about to talk. And that meant one thing. She was getting closer to the truth. Pam Bondi had been waiting for this moment. For days, Charles Lawson had sat in this courtroom, confident, untouchable. But now he was shifting in his chair, avoiding her gaze. His fingers gripping the table as if it could somehow save him. And then he had said it. Words that sent a ripple through the room. I need a deal. The courtroom had gone silent. Pam let the weight of his statement hang in the air before speaking. Mr. Lawson, she said slowly, carefully, are you saying you were following someone else's orders? Lawson's lawyer immediately stood. Your Honor, we need a recess. No, Judge Ellis interrupted, his voice firm. The witness will answer. Lawson swallowed hard. His gaze flicked toward the press, the jury, then back to Pam. And for the first time she saw it, true fear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about who was behind him. Pam took a step forward, voice calm but insistent. Mr. Lawson, I'll ask you again. Who gave the order? Lawson exhaled shakily. I can't say. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Pam's heartbeat quickened. Can't, she repeated. Or won't. His lawyer hissed in his ear, but Lawson shook his head. I can't. Pam's eyes narrowed. She had seen this before. A man who was too afraid to talk. And that only meant one thing. Whoever was pulling the strings was more dangerous than she had thought. A last-minute interruption. Before she could press further, the back doors of the courtroom slammed open. A security officer hurried in, whispering something to the bailiff. Judge Ellis frowned. What's going on? The bailiff hesitated, then walked over and placed a piece of paper in front of him. Pam watched as the judge's expression darkened. We are taking a recess, Ellis announced, his voice tense. Jury, you are dismissed until further notice. Confusion spread through the room. Pam turned toward the defense table, where Lawson looked pale as a ghost. Something was happening, something big. And she wasn't about to be left in the dark. As the judge exited, Pam hurried toward the bailiff. What is it? She demanded. The bailiff shook his head. You didn't hear this from me, he murmured. But Judge Gates was found. Pam's stomach clenched. She knew what was coming. She could feel it. Still she asked, alive? No. A cover-up unraveling. Pam stepped outside the courthouse, inhaling the crisp afternoon air. This wasn't just a case anymore. It wasn't just about fraud. Someone had just eliminated a sitting judge. She pulled out her phone, dialing her investigator. Tell me you have something. We might. Pam's grip tightened on the phone. Talk. The last person Gates spoke to? It wasn't Lawson. Pam frowned. Then who? Hesitation. A senator. Pam's pulse spiked. Senator. This went all the way to Washington. She ran a hand through her hair, piecing it together. Gates was dirty, but he was just one piece of the puzzle. Lawson was funding something. Gates was covering for someone. And that someone had just silenced their own judge. The stakes just got higher. The next morning, Pam walked back into the courthouse with purpose. She had spent all night going over the files, connecting the dots. This was organized, deliberate, dangerous. And it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about power. As she entered the courtroom, she noticed two things immediately. Lawson was already there, looking more anxious than ever. Two federal agents were standing in the back. Pam knew what that meant. The government was stepping in. She took her seat, and moments later, Judge Ellis entered, looking more serious than usual. "This court has been informed of new developments," he announced. "Due to the nature of this case, federal authorities are now involved." Pam's eyes flicked to Lawson. He knew what was coming. And if he had been afraid before, now he was terrified. Pam Bondi sat at the plaintiff's table, her mind racing. The presence of federal agents in the courtroom confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just about Charles Lawson. This wasn't just about Judge Gates. This was bigger. And now, the government was watching. Judge Ellis adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "This court is now aware of recent developments regarding the previous presiding judge," he said. "Due to the seriousness of these allegations, Mr. Lawson, you have the opportunity to cooperate with federal authorities." Lawson's lawyer immediately leaned in, whispering urgently to his client. Pam watched as fear gripped him. He knew what was coming. Lawson was running out of options. And he was about to make a choice that would change everything. A deal with the devil. Pam tapped her pen against the table, waiting. She knew this moment was delicate. She had seen it before. The split second when a man decided whether to protect his empire or save himself. And in that moment Lawson cracked. "I'll talk," he said, voice barely above a whisper. His lawyer stiffened. "Charles, I need protection," Lawson added quickly, his hand shaking. "You don't understand. If I talk, I'm dead." A hush fell over the room. Pam felt it, the weight of the confession before it even came. Judge Ellis nodded toward the agents. "You will be placed in federal custody and given the opportunity to cooperate fully. But before that," he gestured toward Pam, "this court still has unfinished business." She stood, steadying herself. This was it. She stepped forward. "Mr. Lawson, who was Judge Gates protecting?" Silence. Heartbeat stretched too long. "A senator." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Pam's stomach clenched. They were right. She took a slow breath, pressing forward. "Which senator?" Lawson hesitated. His eyes darted to the agents in the back of the room. "Senator William Hawthorne." The courtroom exploded. Murmurs. The press scrambled, cameras clicking in rapid succession. Pam barely reacted. She had suspected it. But hearing it confirmed. That was something else entirely. Senator Hawthorne was a powerful man. Respected. Untouchable. And now, suppose, no one is untouchable. Judge Ellis struck the gavel 3 times. "Order. This court will not tolerate disruptions." But it was too late. The news was out. The government was involved. And Hawthorne's name was now public record. Pam turned back to Lawson. "Tell me, Mr. Lawson," she said, voice smooth. "Did Judge Gates work alone?" Lawson shook his head, his breathing ragged. "There are others." Pam's pulse spiked. "Names." Lawson exhaled sharply then. "I don't know them all. But Hawthorne, he's the one who makes the calls. He controls the funding, the votes, the judges, the police." He swallowed. "He controls everything." Pam stared at him. And in that moment she realized. This wasn't just about one corrupt official. This was about an entire system. And she had just cracked it wide open. The fallout begins. Before the day ended, news stations were already running the headline. "Senator William Hawthorne implicated in federal corruption scandal." Pam watched from her office as the reports came in. FBI agents were already moving. Doors were being kicked in. Records seized. She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. It wasn't over. Not even close. But she had done it. She had exposed the truth. And the people at the top. They were finally falling. This case proves that no one is untouchable. Powerful people rely on fear and silence. But when one voice speaks out, the truth spreads like wildfire. What do you think? Do you believe justice always wins in the end? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit the like button. Your support brings these stories to life. And if you believe that the truth should never be hidden, subscribe and become part of our community. Because in the next story, we uncover even more. The weight of what had just happened still hung in the air. Pam Bondi sat at her desk, watching the breaking news unfold on every major network. Senator William Hawthorne implicated in widespread corruption case. FBI raids underway as officials investigate bribery and judicial misconduct. How deep does this conspiracy go? It was happening. The system that had protected men like Hawthorne for years was finally cracking. But Pam knew better than to celebrate. Because if history had taught her anything, it was this. Powerful men don't go down without a fight. A sudden change of plans. Her phone rang. Not her office line. Her personal phone. She hesitated. Only a handful of people had this number. She answered. Silence. I warned you. Pam's breath stilled. The voice was familiar. It was the same voice from the anonymous call before. She tightened her grip on the phone. Who is this? Chuckle. Whoa. Calculated. You really think this is over? Pam's jaw clenched. I think people like you are finally running out of places to hide. Oz. You're making enemies you can't afford. The line went dead. Pam exhaled slowly. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The pressure mounts. The next morning the headlines had changed. Hawthorne denies allegations, calls accusations a political attack. Sources claim no direct evidence linking the senator to criminal activity. Pam's eyes narrowed. She knew what was happening. The machine was pushing back. Politicians, lobbyists, news networks that owed favors. They were already working to protect him. Her phone buzzed. It was her investigator. Tell me you have something. Oz. We found the missing records. Pam stood immediately. Where? A warehouse outside the city. And you're not going to believe what's in them. Pam grabbed her coat and keys. Because if they had the right evidence, this case wasn't just about Hawthorne anymore. It was about everyone he was protecting. The warehouse discovery. The drive was tense. Pam's mind raced through the possibilities. Bank statements. Offshore accounts. Direct ties between Hawthorne and Gates. She arrived at the warehouse where her investigator, Mark Davis, was waiting. This way, he said, leading her inside. The place was dimly lit, dusty, but filled with boxes. Pam's heart pounded as she stepped forward. Mark opened one of the boxes, pulling out a folder marked, Confidential. Pam took it, opened it, and froze. These weren't just financial records. These were names, judges, police officers, business executives. Her stomach dropped. Other senators. Mark exhaled sharply. This isn't just corruption, Pam. His voice was barely a whisper. This is an entire network. Pam closed the folder. If this got out, the entire political landscape could change overnight. And that's when she knew. She had just become the biggest target in the country. A dangerous decision. Pam sat in her car, gripping the folder. She had two choices. One, hand this over to the FBI. Let them take it from here. Two, go public. Expose everything before they had a chance to bury it. But she knew the risks. If she went public, the people on this list wouldn't just go after her career. They'd go after her life. She took a breath, checked her phone. No new calls, no messages, but she could feel it. She wasn't alone. She looked up at the rearview mirror and saw a black SUV parked across the street. The engine was running, watching, waiting. Pam's grip tightened on the folder. If she didn't act now, she might never get the chance. This case just proved one thing. Corruption doesn't just happen. It's built. It's protected. And when someone threatens to expose it, the real fight begins. What would you do? Would you risk everything to expose the truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story had you on edge, hit the like button. Your support helps bring more of these stories to light. And if you believe in the power of truth, subscribe and join our community. Because in the next chapter, Pam Bondi makes her move. And the consequences will be deadly. Pam Bondi gripped the steering wheel, her heart pounding. The black SUV parked across the street hadn't moved. Whoever was inside wasn't trying to be discreet. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was a message. She had two options. Drive away and pretend she didn't see them. Confront them head-on. Pam wasn't one to run. She exhaled, steadied herself, and opened the car door. The SUV's engine revved, ready. She took a slow step forward. Then another. The windows were tinted, impossible to see inside. Pam clenched her jaw. They wanted her afraid. They wanted her to second-guess everything. She wasn't giving them that. But just as she reached for her phone, the SUV peeled away. Tires screeched. Pam stood there, her pulse racing. They didn't need to do anything. They just needed her to know. They were watching. And if she made the wrong move, they'd be waiting. The evidence that could bring them down. Pam returned to her office, locking the door behind her. She placed the confidential folder on her desk. She knew what was inside, but she needed to go through it carefully. Every single page. She grabbed a pen, started marking the most important details. Offshore accounts, backroom deals, direct orders. Each document tied a piece of the puzzle together. And when she finally found what she was looking for, her blood ran cold. A transfer. Not just any transfer. A $3.2 million transaction. The sender. A company tied to Senator Hawthorne. The recipient. Judge Howard Gates. This was it. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't just whispers in the dark. This was evidence. Evidence that could destroy powerful men. And if she had found it, so had they. Her phone buzzed. She hesitated before answering. Pam, Mark Davis's voice came through. You need to leave your office. Now. Pam's stomach twisted. Why? They know. No safe place left. Pam grabbed the folder and shoved it into her bag. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She just moved. She stepped out into the hallway. And stopped. A man stood by the elevators. Dark suit. Hands folded. Watching her. Pam turned on her heel, taking the back stairwell instead. Ran. Her breath was sharp, her heart hammering in her chest. By the time she reached the garage, Mark was already waiting, engine running. Get in. She barely had the door closed before he sped off. Pam's hands trembled as she opened her bag, pulling out the folder. We have everything we need, she said. We go public. Mark kept his eyes on the road. You sure? Pam nodded. There's no time to play it safe. If we don't control the story, they will. Mark exhaled. All right. Let's bring them down. The final decision. They parked outside a news station. Pam knew the risks. The second she walked in with this evidence, there was no going back. They would try to discredit her. They would try to bury her. But the truth was bigger than the risk. Pam reached for the door handle, then stopped. A text message appeared on her phone. Unknown number. Look away. Last chance. Pam's fingers curled around the phone. Whoa. They didn't get to decide this. She pushed open the door, stepped into the newsroom, and prepared to blow it all wide open. Pam Bondi walked into the newsroom with purpose. The folder in her hands wasn't just paper. It was proof. It was power. And once this went public, there was no undoing it. A young producer met her at the entrance, eyes wide. You need to see the anchor, he said, motioning her toward a back office. Pam nodded. They weren't wasting time. She followed him down a dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with anticipation. She knew what was coming. And she was ready. Going public. The anchor sat at his desk, reviewing notes. He looked up as Pam entered. You're sure about this? He asked. Pam set the folder on his desk. See for yourself. He hesitated, then opened it. Pam watched as his expression shifted. The color drained from his face. He flipped through the documents. Bank transfers. Offshore accounts. Direct ties to Senator Hawthorne. Jesus, he muttered. Pam folded her arms. "This isn't just corruption," she said. "It's a criminal network." The anchor exhaled. "If we air this, you know what happens next, right?" Pam didn't blink. "They'll come after me." "I know." The anchor leaned back, rubbing his temple. "They'll come after all of us." Pam sat across from him. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than me." She leaned forward. "They tried to silence a federal judge. And when that didn't work, they killed him." The anchor froze. She continued. "They're already watching me. Threatening me. That means they're afraid." Pam pointed at the folder. This is how we finish them." Silence. The anchor picked up his phone. "Clear the 7 p.m. slot," he told his producer. Pam's pulse quickened. It was happening. The world was about to know. The broadcast that changed everything. At exactly 7 p.m. the news went live. Pam sat across from the anchor, cameras rolling. The intro music faded. And then, "Tonight, we bring you a story that will shake Washington to its core," the anchor began. Pam's name flashed across the screen. The documents appeared on air. And the world listened. As the story unfolded, phones across the country lit up. Politicians, law enforcement, the media, everyone was watching. And then, Pam said his name. "Senator William Hawthorne." The anchor nodded. "We reached out to Senator Hawthorne's office for a statement. They declined to comment." Pam looked directly into the camera. "If something happens to me after tonight, you'll know why." The newsroom was silent. "We'll be right back," the anchor said. The screen cut to black. And just like that, the truth was out. The fallout begins. Within minutes, the internet exploded. #Hawthorne scandal was trending worldwide. Networks were picking up the story. Federal agencies were responding. Pam watched from behind the scenes as the newsroom went into chaos. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages. Warnings. A number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Pam exhaled slowly. "No." She looked at the screen, where Hawthorne's name flashed across the news. "I just made yours." Blick. She hung up. And the fight was just beginning. This case just proved one thing. When people stand together, the truth cannot be buried. But what do you think? Do you believe justice will be served? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story kept you on edge, hit the like button. Your support helps bring these investigations to light. And if you believe in holding the powerful accountable, subscribe and join our community. Because this story is far from over.